A family adopts a black girl, welcoming her into their lives with warmth. But as she quickly learns to speak English, a mysterious truth begins to come out, causing the parents to panic. Could her past hold dangerous secrets? And what will they do when the truth comes to light? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Beth's hand trembled slightly as she turned the key in the front door. Next to her, Angela stood quietly, her small hand wrapped tightly in Beth's, stepping into a new world after spending some time at the adoption center. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Beth said softly, pushing the door open. Angela's dark eyes widened as she took in the warm living room with its comfortable blue couch and soft cream-colored walls. Her grip on Beth's hand loosened just a bit as curiosity began to overtake her initial shyness. Tom carried Angela's small purple suitcase up the carpeted stairs, his footsteps gentle and measured. "Let's show you your room first," Beth suggested, giving Angela an encouraging smile. As they climbed the stairs, Angela's free hand trailed along the wooden banister. Beth's heart swelled watching the little girl take in every detail. They'd spent weeks preparing the bedroom, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and filling the bookshelf with colorful picture books. That first week passed in a blur of gentle discoveries and new routines. Beth marveled at how quickly Angela picked up English words, pointing at objects around the house with growing confidence. "Book," Angela would say softly at bedtime, her pronunciation careful and precise. "That's right," Beth would beam, pulling another story from the shelf. Her teacher's heart soared at Angela's eagerness to learn. Tom, working at his desk in the home office, found himself looking forward to their lunch breaks together. Angela would sit at the kitchen table, carefully copying letters in her notebook while he made sandwiches. "Sandwich," she'd repeat after him, a small smile playing at her lips. Bath time became a favorite routine, with Angela delighting in the bubble bath Beth prepared each evening. "Duck," she'd say, pointing to the yellow rubber toy floating among the bubbles. "Water! Splash!" Family dinners filled their dining room with warmth. Though Angela ate quietly, her eyes sparkled as she absorbed the peaceful atmosphere. Beth and Tom would exchange glances across the table, their hearts full at the sight of their daughter beginning to bloom in their care. Each night they developed a bedtime ritual. Beth would sit on the edge of Angela's bed, a storybook open in her lap, while Tom leaned against the doorframe, watching his two favorite people with tender eyes. Angela would snuggle under her pink comforter, pointing at pictures and whispering new words she'd learned. "Family," she said one night, touching a picture of a mother, father, and child in her bedtime story. "That's right, sweetheart," Beth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're your family now." Tom stepped closer, adjusting Angela's blanket with gentle hands. As Beth continued reading, Angela's eyes grew heavy, her breathing becoming slow and steady. The soft glow of her butterfly nightlight cast peaceful shadows on the walls. When the story ended, Beth carefully closed the book. She and Tom stood in the doorway, watching their daughter drift off to sleep. Their eyes met, sharing a moment of pure joy at seeing Angela so peacefully at home in their lives. One day, the kitchen glowed with warm light as Beth and Tom finished their quiet dinner. 6 months had passed since Angela came into their lives, and the changes in her were remarkable. Beth loaded the dishwasher while Tom wiped down the counters, their movements synchronized after years of sharing these simple routines. "I can hardly believe how far her English has come," Beth said, rinsing a plate. "Remember when she first arrived? Now she's speaking in full sentences." Tom smiled, folding the dishcloth neatly. "She's thriving here. Did you see how proud she was today when she read that entire page by herself? She's such a bright girl." Beth's eyes softened. "And she seems so much more comfortable now. Those first few weeks, she barely spoke above a whisper." They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, putting away the last of the dishes. The house felt peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from knowing your loved ones are safe and sound. "Should we check on her before we head to bed?" Beth suggested, hanging the kitchen towel to dry. "I know she's been sleeping well, but I still like to peek in." Tom nodded, following his wife up the carpeted stairs. Their footsteps were quiet, practiced in the art of checking on their sleeping daughter without waking her. The butterfly nightlight cast a gentle glow as they carefully pushed open Angela's door. She lay curled on her side, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one hand clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Beth and Tom stood by her bed, sharing a tender look as they watched their daughter sleep. The peaceful moment was interrupted by a soft murmur from Angela. At first, it was just quiet sounds, but then her words became clearer. "Jason," she whispered, her small face scrunching slightly. "Jason." Beth's hand found Tom's arm, squeezing gently. They listened as Angela repeated the name several more times, her voice carrying a note of sadness that made Beth's heart ache. "Jason," Angela called again, this time with such longing that Beth felt tears prick at her eyes. Tom wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders as they watched their daughter shift in her sleep. The name seemed to fade away as Angela settled back into deeper sleep, but the emotion in her voice lingered in the quiet room. "Do you think he's an imaginary friend?" Beth whispered, looking up at Tom. "Maybe a friend she made up?" Tom's brow furrowed thoughtfully. "Could be someone from the orphanage," he suggested quietly, though they didn't mention anyone by that name in her files. They stood there for a moment longer, watching Angela sleep peacefully now, her earlier distress gone. Without words, they decided to leave her room, carefully backing away and pulling the door nearly closed. In the hallway, Tom gave Beth's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Let's not worry too much yet," he said softly. "We can keep an eye out, see if she mentions him when she's awake." Beth nodded, though concern still shadowed her eyes. "You're right. We don't want to upset her by asking too many questions. We'll just watch and wait." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Beth, Tom, and Angela sat around the breakfast table. Steam rose from their oatmeal bowls, and the smell of cinnamon filled the air. Angela carefully spooned her breakfast, practicing the phrases Beth had taught her. "May I have more milk, please?" Angela asked, her pronunciation clear and careful. "Of course, sweetheart." Beth beamed, reaching for the milk carton. "Your English is getting so good. I'm very proud of you." Angela's face lit up at the praise, her shy smile spreading into a full grin. Tom watched the exchange over his coffee cup, his eyes crinkling with joy at their daughter's progress. "Thank you," Angela replied, sitting up straighter in her chair. Later that afternoon, Angela sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, surrounded by her colored blocks. Beth watched from the couch, folding laundry while keeping an eye on her daughter's play. Tom worked nearby at his desk, occasionally glancing up from his laptop. Angela stacked the blocks carefully, creating a small tower. Then, suddenly, she looked up at Beth with wide, questioning eyes. "Where is Jason?" Beth's hands froze mid-fold on a towel. She caught Tom's startled look from across the room as he stopped typing. "Jason?" Beth asked gently, setting down the laundry. "Who is Jason, sweetheart?" Angela's lower lip trembled slightly. "Jason and me, we lived together." She pushed 2 blocks side by side. Like this. Together. Tom moved from his desk to join them, sitting on the couch beside Beth. "When did you live with Jason?" he asked carefully. "Before." Angela's voice grew quiet. "I miss Jason." She hugged her knees to her chest, her blocks forgotten on the floor. Beth and Tom exchanged worried glances. The emotion in Angela's voice matched the longing they'd heard in her sleep the night before. This wasn't the casual mention of an imaginary friend. Angela's whole demeanor had changed at Jason's name. That evening, after tucking Angela into bed with her favorite stuffed rabbit, Beth and Tom retreated to their bedroom. Beth sat on the edge of their bed, wringing her hands. "Tom, I think Jason might be real," she whispered. "The way she talked about him." Tom nodded, pacing slowly. "We need to look into this. There was nothing in her file about a Jason, but maybe we missed something." "We should contact the orphanage," Beth suggested. "Find out if there was a Jason there when Angela was." Agreed. Tom sat beside his wife. "First thing tomorrow, we'll start going there. There has to be some record of who this Jason is." The autumn wind rustled through the nearly bare trees as Beth and Tom pulled into the orphanage parking lot. Dead leaves skittered across the ground, and dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening rain. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off an inexplicable chill that seemed to seep into her bones. "Ready?" Tom asked, reaching over to squeeze her hand, his warm touch reassuring against her cold fingers. Beth nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Let's get some answers." They walked hand in hand through the heavy wooden doors, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The familiar smell of industrial cleaner and old carpet brought back memories of the day they'd first met Angela. A few children's drawings decorated the otherwise stark walls, their bright colors a stark contrast to the institutional setting. A secretary with graying hair directed them to Mr. Curtis's office, where they found him reviewing paperwork at his desk, his face illuminated by a harsh desk lamp. Mr. Curtis looked up, his thin-rimmed glasses catching the fluorescent light. A forced smile spread across his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, what a surprise. Is everything all right with Angela?" "Angela's doing wonderfully," Beth said, settling into one of the chairs across from his desk, wincing slightly at its uncomfortable wooden frame. "She's actually why we're here. We have some questions about her background." Tom leaned forward slightly, his expression determined but careful. "We're wondering if Angela had any siblings here at the orphanage, specifically a boy named Jason." The change in Mr. Curtis's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders stiffened, and his fingers tightened around his pen until his knuckles whitened. "Jason?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral, though a slight tremor betrayed his unease. "I'm not familiar with any connection between Angela and a child by that name." "Are you certain?" Beth pressed gently, noting how he avoided meeting her eyes. "Angela's been mentioning him quite often. She says they used to play together." Mr. Curtis's chair creaked as he pushed back from his desk, the sound harsh in the tense atmosphere. "Mrs. Hartley, I can assure you that Angela's records are complete. There is no mention of any siblings or a child named Jason." His tone had grown sharp, defensive, like a cornered animal. Tom cleared his throat, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Could we perhaps review her file again, just to be thorough?" "That won't be necessary." Mr. Curtis stood abruptly, straightening papers on his desk with jerky movements that sent several sheets floating to the floor. "The adoption is finalized, and all proper procedures were followed. I suggest you focus on Angela's present rather than dwelling on possible imaginary relationships from her past." Beth felt her chest tighten at his dismissive tone, her heart racing. "Mr. Curtis, we're only trying to understand—" "I believe we're done here," Mr. Curtis cut her off, moving toward the door with unusual haste. "I have other matters requiring my attention. Please see yourselves out." The drive home was quiet, both Beth and Tom lost in their thoughts as rain began to spatter against the windshield. As they pulled into their driveway, Tom turned off the engine but didn't move to get out, the steady rhythm of the wipers finally falling still. "That wasn't normal," Beth said, breaking the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way he reacted when we mentioned Jason?" Tom nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination. He was definitely hiding something. The question is, what? That evening, after they'd finished the dishes and Angela was asleep upstairs, Beth and Tom sat at their kitchen table. A cup of tea grew cold between Beth's hands as they discussed their options, the kitchen clock ticking away the minutes in the background. The warm yellow light from above cast a cozy glow that did little to dispel their growing concerns. "We need help," Tom said finally, running a hand through his hair. "Someone who knows how to dig deeper than we can." Beth and Tom then decided to hire a personal investigator. They went to his office the very same day. The private investigator's office was neat and organized, with filing cabinets lining one wall and certificates hanging on another. Daniel, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and keen eyes, listened intently as Beth and Tom shared their story. "And that's when Mr. Curtis practically pushed us out of his office," Beth concluded, wringing her hands in her lap. Daniel nodded, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. "His reaction certainly raises some red flags. Tell me more about Angela's mentions of Jason." Tom leaned forward. "She calls out his name in her sleep, and recently asked us where he was. She said they used to play together. Children that age rarely fabricate such specific memories, Daniel noted, his expression thoughtful. I'll start by checking the digital records and cross-referencing adoption databases. Over the next few days, Daniel immersed himself in the investigation. His computer screen flickered late into the night as he followed digital trails and examined adoption records. Each piece of information led to another, forming a disturbing pattern. On the fourth day, his persistence paid off. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and carefully worded documents, he found what he was looking for: proof of Angela's brother Jason. The siblings had entered the orphanage together, but their files had been deliberately separated. As Daniel dug deeper, more troubling details emerged. He discovered a pattern in Mr. Curtis's adoption arrangements. Single-child adoptions commanded higher fees than sibling groups, and Mr. Curtis had orchestrated several suspicious separations over the years. The financial records showed significant discrepancies, with extra fees being channeled through various accounts. Daniel reached for his phone, knowing Beth and Tom needed to hear this immediately. The call connected after 2 rings. "Beth, this is Daniel Evans. I have some information you need to hear." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I can confirm that Angela does indeed have a brother named Jason. They were at the orphanage together." Beth's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. So she wasn't imagining it? No, she wasn't. And there's more. Daniel's voice grew grave. "I've found evidence suggesting Mr. Curtis deliberately separated them. The adoption fees for single children are substantially higher than for siblings, and it appears he's been exploiting this difference for personal gain." "He split them up for money?" Tom's voice joined in, thick with anger. "That's what the evidence suggests," Daniel confirmed. "I'm still gathering documentation, but the pattern is clear." Beth's voice trembled as she spoke. "All this time, Angela's been missing her brother because Mr. Curtis wanted to make more money?" "I know this is difficult news," Daniel said gently, "but now we have proof. Angela's memories were real, and we can take steps to address this situation. I will come in the evening to discuss this in more detail with you guys." In the evening, Daniel, the PI, sat at the Hartleys' kitchen table, methodically spreading out documents and photographs across the wooden surface. Beth clutched her coffee mug tightly between both hands, the warmth providing little comfort, while Tom leaned forward in his chair, studying the papers with intense focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The Hughes family lives in Millbrook, about 40 minutes from here," Daniel explained, pointing to an address on one of the documents, his finger tapping the paper for emphasis. "They adopted Jason 1 year ago, a bit before you adopted Angela. Their neighborhood seems quite similar to yours, suburban, family-oriented." Beth's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a copy of Jason's adoption record, her eyes scanning the crucial details. "And look here. It clearly states, single child, no known relatives." They deliberately hid Angela's existence. How could they do this to innocent children? "Exactly," Daniel nodded grimly, pulling out another document from his organized stack. "I've found similar patterns in other cases. Mr. Curtis systematically separated siblings to maximize adoption fees. It's been his practice for years, carefully hidden beneath legitimate paperwork." Tom ran a hand through his graying hair, his expression troubled as he processed the information. "So what's our next step? We can't just show up at their doorstep? That could frighten everyone involved." "I've gathered their contact information," Daniel said, sliding over a neat sheet of paper filled with carefully typed details. "My suggestion would be a careful phone call. The Hughes family might be just as surprised as you were to learn about this. They could be valuable allies in making this right." Beth and Tom spent the next hour discussing their approach in detail, carefully crafting what they would say, weighing each word. Finally, with trembling fingers, Beth dialed the number while Tom held her free hand, offering silent support from his seat beside her. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, warm and curious. "Hello? Mrs. Hughes?" Beth's voice wavered slightly despite her preparation. "My name is Beth Hartley. I hope you don't mind me calling, but we need to discuss something important about Jason. Something that might change everything." There was a pause on the other end, filled with tension. "Is everything all right?" Beth took a deep breath, steadying herself against Tom's reassuring presence. "Yes, everything's fine. You see, we adopted a little girl named Angela last year. She's been mentioning someone named Jason in her sleep, and through our investigation, we've discovered that they might be siblings. We have documentation to support this." A sharp intake of breath came through the phone, followed by rustling sounds. "Siblings? But we were told Jason had no family. The paperwork was very clear about that." "We were told the same about Angela," Tom added gently, leaning closer to the phone. "We've uncovered evidence that the orphanage deliberately separated them. We believe both our families were misled." Mrs. Hughes was quiet for a moment, and they could hear muffled conversation in the background. "Jason sometimes talks about a girl he used to play with. We thought she was just a friend from the orphanage. He draws pictures of her sometimes." "Would you be willing to meet with us?" Beth asked hopefully, her heart pounding. "We believe the children should have a chance to see each other again, to know the truth about their family." After a brief discussion with her husband in the background, punctuated by whispered words they couldn't quite catch, Mrs. Hughes agreed. "We could meet this weekend. There's a park halfway between our towns. It would be neutral ground for everyone." When the call ended, Beth and Tom sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of what had just happened settling over them. Daniel gathered his documents quietly, giving them an encouraging smile as he worked. "Saturday at noon," Beth whispered, still holding the phone like a lifeline. "We're going to meet them at Riverside Park. It's really happening." Tom squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting both hope and concern. "We're doing the right thing. These children deserve to know the truth about each other." "I'll have all the documentation ready if you need it," Daniel assured them as he packed his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Just focus on the children. That's what matters most right now." On Saturday morning, Beth sat on Angela's bed, helping her choose a special outfit for the park. The little girl's excitement was visible as she bounced on her toes, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart?" Beth asked gently. "We're going to meet a boy named Jason today. He might be your brother from before you came to live with us." Angela's eyes widened. "My Jason?" she asked softly. Tom appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand. "That's right, sweetie. Would you like to meet him?" Angela nodded eagerly, hugging her rabbit closer. The drive to Riverside Park was quiet, filled with anticipation. Beth kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Angela, who stared out the window with unusual focus. When they pulled into the parking lot, Tom spotted another family already waiting near the playground. "That must be them," he said, giving Beth's hand a reassuring squeeze. The Hughes family stood together near a wooden bench. John, tall and formal in a polo shirt, Sarah, petite with kind eyes, and between them, a small boy with dark hair who clung to his mother's hand. Jason. Beth and Tom approached Angela between them, exchanging tentative smiles with the Hughes family. "Hello," Sarah spoke first, her voice warm. "We're so glad you could come." John nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Yes, welcome." The children stared at each other with unveiled curiosity. Jason half hid behind Sarah's leg while Angela pressed closer to Beth. "Would you like to play on the swings?" Beth suggested gently, kneeling beside Angela. Sarah did the same with Jason. "That sounds fun, doesn't it? You love the swings." The children nodded, and with gentle encouragement from both sets of parents, they walked toward the playground. At first, they moved cautiously, stealing glances at each other. But when Jason climbed onto a swing, Angela took the one next to him. The adults watched from nearby benches as the children's initial shyness began to melt away. Soon, the sound of their laughter carried across the playground as they took turns pushing each other on the swings. "They seem to remember each other," Sarah observed softly, watching as Angela showed Jason how to pump his legs to swing higher. "Angela's been talking about him for weeks," Beth shared. "In her sleep, during playtime." Tom noticed John's posture stiffened slightly at this information, but the man remained silent, his eyes fixed on the children. After an hour of playing, moving from swings to slides to the sandbox, Angela and Jason returned to their parents, both slightly out of breath and wearing bright smiles. Did you have fun? Beth asked, brushing some sand from Angela's dress. Angela nodded enthusiastically. I had fun with Jason, she declared, casting a shy glance at her brother. The Hughes family exchanged looks before Sarah suggested, perhaps we could do this again next weekend. We'd like that, Tom replied, noting how Jason's face lit up at the suggestion. The following Saturday dawned bright and crisp as the Hartleys made their way back to Riverside Park again. This time, Angela practically bounced in her car seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit and asking every few minutes if they were almost there. When they arrived, the Hughes family was already waiting. The moment Angela spotted Jason, her face lit up with recognition. She rushed forward, and to everyone's surprise and delight, the children shared a spontaneous hug. Jason? Angela exclaimed, her voice full of joy. Hi, Angela, Jason replied shyly but with a big smile. Sarah Hughes dabbed at her eyes, clearly moved by the children's natural affection. Even John's usually stern expression softened as he watched the touching reunion. While the children ran off to play in the jungle gym, the adults settled on nearby benches. Beth took a deep breath and shared what they had learned from their private investigator. Mr. Curtis deliberately separated them, she explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. He marked both children as having no siblings to increase the adoption fees. Sarah gasped, But that's terrible. We had no idea Jason had a sister. The paperwork we received showed him as an only child. That's exactly what our investigator found, Tom added, pulling out some documents from his briefcase. Look at these records. They were altered to hide their connection. John leaned forward, his businessman's demeanor giving way to genuine concern as he examined the papers. This is serious misconduct. We paid premium fees because Jason was listed as a single child with no family ties. We did too with Angela, Beth nodded. Daniel, our investigator, believes Mr. Curtis has been doing this for years, separating siblings for profit. The adults watched as Angela showed Jason how to climb the monkey bars, their laughter carrying across the playground. They deserve to know each other, Sarah said firmly. Whatever Mr. Curtis did, we can't let it keep them apart now. We agree completely, Tom replied. Would you be open to regular meetups? Let them build their relationship naturally? Of course, John answered, surprising everyone with his quick agreement. Jason needs this connection, we all do. They spent the next hour planning future meetups while watching the children play. Angela and Jason had moved to the sandbox, building elaborate castles together and chatting as if they'd never been separated. When the afternoon began winding down, neither child wanted to leave. Angela wrapped her arms around Jason in a tight hug. See you next time? Jason asked hopefully. Next time, Angela agreed with a bright smile. The families parted ways with warm handshakes and confirmed plans for the following weekend. As Beth helped Angela into her car seat, she noticed her daughter was still beaming, clutching her stuffed rabbit close. Later that day, Beth and Tom got a call from Daniel, asking to come to his office on an urgent basis. I've uncovered something significant, Daniel began, his voice steady but grave. Angela and Jason's biological parents weren't ordinary people. They were quite wealthy. Beth's hand found Tom's and squeezed it tightly. Wealthy? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, pulling out several documents. Their parents left behind a substantial inheritance. Based on these records, we're talking about a trust fund worth several $1 million, meant to be split between both children. Tom leaned forward, his engineering mind already calculating. And Mr. Curtis knew about this? That's what makes this situation particularly troubling, Daniel explained, spreading out more papers across his desk. I found evidence that Mr. Curtis accessed these financial records shortly before separating the siblings. He deliberately arranged separate adoptions, marking each child as having no living relatives. Beth's face flushed with anger. He kept them apart on purpose? Just for money? It appears so, Daniel confirmed. By separating them and hiding their connection, he prevented either family from discovering the inheritance. The adoption fees he charged were just the beginning. He likely had plans to access the trust fund himself using his position as their former guardian. Tom's jaw clenched. That's why he became so defensive when we asked about Jason. Exactly, Daniel said. He probably thought his scheme was falling apart. And it is, just not the way he expected. Beth wiped away tears of frustration. Those poor children. All this time they could have been together. Should have been together. "What's our next step?" Tom asked, his voice steady despite his obvious anger. Daniel gathered the documents into a neat pile. "We have enough evidence to confront Mr. Curtis. The altered adoption records alone show clear misconduct, but combined with the hidden inheritance..." He shook his head. "This goes beyond unethical, it's criminal." Beth stood up, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "We need to make this right, not just for the money but for Angela and Jason. They deserve to know the truth about their family." Tom nodded in agreement, gathering the copies Daniel had prepared for them. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on their shoulders as they prepared to leave the office. Both parents united in their determination to seek justice for their daughter and her brother. Soon, Beth and Tom pulled into the orphanage parking lot. Beth clutched her leather portfolio containing Daniel's documentation, her knuckles white with determination. Tom placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before they stepped out of the car. "Everything's in place," Tom said quietly. "The police are ready if we need them." They walked through the familiar entrance, the building's institutional smell hitting them differently now that they knew its secrets. The receptionist directed them to Mr. Curtis's office, where they found him sitting behind his large desk, appearing smaller than they remembered. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartley," he said, his voice carrying forced politeness. "What brings you back so soon?" Beth opened her portfolio and spread several documents across his desk. "We know about Angela and Jason's inheritance, Mr. Curtis. And we know what you did." Mr. Curtis's face twitched slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. As I told you before..." "We have proof," Tom interrupted, his voice steady as he pointed to specific documents. "These are the original inheritance records, and these are the adoption papers you altered." Mr. Curtis's eyes darted between the papers, his confident demeanor cracking. "These documents are confidential. You have no right..." "We hired a private investigator," Beth said, her voice growing stronger. "He found everything. The trust fund, the separated adoptions, your attempts to hide their connection." Sweat beaded on Mr. Curtis's forehead. "Now let's not jump to conclusions. The police are already involved," Tom stated firmly. "They're very interested in how you've been handling adoptions here." At the mention of police, Mr. Curtis's face drained of color. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand. The system is complicated. Sometimes decisions have to be made." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. 2 police officers appeared in the doorway, their presence filling the small office. "Mr. Curtis," one officer said, "we need you to come with us. We have some questions about your adoption practices." Mr. Curtis slumped back into his chair, the fight leaving him. "I was just trying to maintain the orphanage," he muttered. "The money would have helped so many children." "By stealing from 2 of them?" Beth's voice shook with controlled anger. The officers stepped forward, and Mr. Curtis didn't resist as they led him from the office. Beth and Tom watched as he was escorted through the hallway, his shoulders hunched in defeat. As they walked back to their car, Beth felt lighter despite the emotional weight of the morning. Tom squeezed her hand as they prepared to head home, both knowing they had done the right thing for Angela and Jason. The next day, both families settled into a quiet corner of the cafe for a meet. Angela and Jason sat at a nearby table, their heads bent over coloring books, while their parents gathered around a larger table. Beth's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Mr. Curtis was arrested this morning," Tom began quietly, keeping his voice low enough not to attract the children's attention. "The evidence was overwhelming." Sarah Hughes gasped softly while John leaned forward, his expression intense. "What exactly did you find?" Beth shared the details about the inheritance and Mr. Curtis's deception, watching as the Hughes' faces registered shock and disbelief. "He deliberately separated them to prevent anyone from discovering the truth about their inheritance," she explained. "I can't believe we never knew," Sarah whispered, glancing at Jason with tears in her eyes. Beth took a deep breath, exchanging a look with Tom before continuing. "We've been thinking about what's best for both children," she said carefully. "Seeing them together, how naturally they've bonded. We believe they should have the chance to grow up as siblings." "What exactly are you suggesting?" John asked, his voice tight. "We'd like to adopt Jason," Tom said gently, "to keep them together. You already have 2 children of your own." The Hughes family fell silent. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, and John's jaw clenched visibly. The only sounds were the children's giggles from the nearby table. "This isn't about the inheritance," Beth added quickly. "We're thinking solely about their emotional well-being. They've already lost so much time together." "Jason is our son," John said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "We've raised him for a year." "We understand that," Tom responded. "We know this is an enormous thing to ask." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, watching Jason and Angela share colored pencils. "They do seem so happy together," she whispered. "We need time," John said, his expression softening slightly as he too watched the children. "This isn't something we can decide right now." "Of course," Beth nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze Sarah's hand. "Take all the time you need. We're just grateful you're willing to consider it." "Could we meet again next week?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. "We need to process everything." "Absolutely," Tom agreed. "Whatever you decide, we appreciate you keeping the children connected." The families watched their children playing, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air between them. Angela showed Jason her drawing, their laughter a stark contrast to the serious conversation taking place just feet away. The next day dragged by slowly as Beth and Tom waited for news from the Hughes family. Beth kept checking her phone, while Tom tried to stay busy with work, but found himself distracted. Angela played with her toys in the living room, occasionally asking when she would see Jason again. "They'll call when they're ready," Tom reassured Beth, watching her pace near the phone. When evening came, the phone finally rang. Beth's hand trembled as she answered it. "Hello?" "Beth, it's John Hughes. Sarah and I would like to meet to discuss our decision. Could you and Tom meet us at the Pine Street Cafe tomorrow morning?" "Yes, of course," Beth replied, her heart racing. "What time?" They arranged to meet at 10 the next morning. Beth shared a hopeful look with Tom after hanging up. The cafe was quiet when they arrived the next day. John and Sarah Hughes were already there with Jason, seated at a corner table. The boy's face lit up when he saw Beth and Tom, but John kept a firm hand on his shoulder. After brief hellos, John cleared his throat. "We've given this a lot of thought," he began, his voice steady. "We appreciate your concern for the children, but we've decided we can't agree to your proposal. Jason is our son now, legally and in our hearts." Beth's face fell. "But surely you can see how important it is for siblings to be together." "We understand your position," John replied, his tone growing firmer. "But we've raised Jason for a year. We're his family now, and we have full parental rights." Sarah nodded, though her eyes showed conflict. "We do care about what's best for Jason." "And what about his inheritance?" Tom asked carefully, noticing how John's expression shifted at the mention of money. "That's part of Jason's future that we'll manage as his parents," John replied, a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "We'll make sure his interests are protected." Beth noticed how John emphasized the word interests, and her heart sank as she realized their true motivation. "We hope you'll still allow the children to see each other," Tom said, trying to salvage something from the conversation. "Of course," Sarah quickly replied, but John's expression remained guarded. "We should go," John announced, standing up. He guided Jason toward the door, though the boy looked back at Beth and Tom with sad eyes. Beth watched them leave, her hands clenched in her lap. Tom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but they both knew this wasn't over. The Hughes family's decision, clearly influenced by financial motives, left them feeling helpless but determined to fight for what was right. The next morning dawned gray and chilly as Beth and Tom made their way to the law offices of Patricia Reese, family attorney at law. The building stood tall in downtown, its windows reflecting the cloudy sky like mirrors in the early light. A bitter wind whipped around the corners as Tom squeezed Beth's hand reassuringly while they rode the elevator to the 10th floor, the gentle hum of machinery filling the tense silence between them. Patricia Reese's office was warm and welcoming, with comfortable leather chairs and diplomas lining the walls in polished wooden frames. Soft lighting from table lamps created a cozy atmosphere that helped put clients at ease. She greeted them with a firm handshake and an understanding smile, gesturing for them to sit in the plush chairs facing her impressive mahogany desk. "Tell me about your situation," Patricia said, opening a leather-bound notebook and clicking her pen with practiced efficiency. Beth and Tom took turns explaining everything: Angela and Jason's connection, the orphanage scandal, and the Hughes family's refusal to consider shared custody. Patricia listened intently, her experienced eyes sharp and focused as she occasionally jotted down notes, her pen scratching quietly against the paper. "I understand your desire to keep the siblings together," Patricia said, setting down her pen and folding her hands on the desk. "However, I need to be clear about something. The Hughes family has strong legal standing here. As Jason's adoptive parents, they have full parental rights, and that carries significant weight in family court." Beth's shoulders slumped, her hopes visibly deflating. "But surely the fact that they're siblings counts for something." "It does," Patricia nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "But courts typically favor maintaining stable existing family units unless there's clear evidence that it's harmful to the child. We'd need to build a compelling case showing that separating the siblings would significantly impact their emotional well-being. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible." Tom leaned forward in his chair, his expression determined. "What kind of evidence would we need?" "Documentation of their interactions, professional evaluations showing the importance of their sibling bond, perhaps testimony from child psychologists," Patricia explained, ticking off points on her fingers. "We'd also need to prove that regular contact between them would serve their best interests. Every piece of evidence helps build our case." "And what about the inheritance situation?" Beth asked, wringing her hands in her lap. "The Hughes family seems more interested in controlling Jason's money than considering what's best for him. Surely that matters." Patricia made another note, her brow furrowing slightly. "That's concerning, but proving their motives would be challenging. We'd need concrete evidence that they're acting against Jason's interests, not just suspicions." While Beth and Tom gathered their legal options across town, Jason sat quietly in his room at the Hughes house, the morning light casting long shadows across the carpet. His favorite toys, trucks, action figures, and building blocks, lay untouched on the floor as he stared out the window, his small face pressed against the cool glass. Sarah Hughes watched from the doorway, her heart aching as she noticed how her usually energetic son had grown quiet and withdrawn over the past few days, like a flower wilting without sunlight. "Jason, honey, would you like to play outside?" Sarah asked softly, trying to keep her voice cheerful. "The swing set is all dry now." Jason shook his head, not turning from the window. "When can I see Angela again?" His voice was small and sad, tugging at Sarah's conscience. Sarah hesitated, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. "We'll see, sweetie. Why don't we have some lunch? I made your favorite sandwich." But Jason turned back to the window, his small shoulders slumped beneath his favorite blue sweater. The joy that had filled him during his reunions with Angela seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a confusion and sadness that no amount of toys or treats could dispel. Back in Patricia's office, the attorney reviewed her notes with careful consideration, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "I suggest we consider proposing joint custody or structured visitation rights. It's less confrontational than seeking full custody, and courts often favor compromise solutions that benefit the children." "How would that work exactly?" Tom asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. "We could propose regular scheduled visits, shared holidays, maybe even some weekends together," Patricia explained, sketching out a rough calendar on her notepad. "It would allow the siblings to maintain their relationship while respecting both families' parental rights. We could create a schedule that works for everyone." Beth wiped away a tear with trembling fingers, hope flickering in her eyes. "Do you think the Hughes family would agree to that? They've been so resistant to everything so far." It's worth trying to negotiate before we pursue legal action, Patricia advised, her voice carrying years of experience. A court battle could be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally draining for everyone, especially the children. Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough to bring people to the negotiating table. Tom nodded slowly, his hand finding Beth's again. So you think we should meet with them one more time? Yes, Patricia confirmed, closing her notebook with quiet authority. I can help you draft a proposal that protects everyone's interests while prioritizing the children's emotional well-being. Sometimes, showing a willingness to compromise can open doors that seemed firmly closed. It's often surprising how reasonable people can be when presented with a well-thought-out solution. Beth and Tom exchanged glances, years of marriage allowing them to communicate volumes in a single look, knowing this might be their best chance at keeping Angela and Jason connected. They agreed to Patricia's suggestion, hoping the Hughes family would be willing to consider a middle ground that could bring peace to both families and, most importantly, happiness to the children who needed each other so desperately. The following week, a calm breeze rustled through the park's maple trees as Beth and Tom settled onto a wooden bench, watching Angela and Jason head toward the playground. John and Sarah Hughes sat on a nearby bench, maintaining a polite but tense distance. The children's laughter carried across the park as they raced to the swings, their feet kicking up wood chips in their wake. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground equipment, painting everything in warm golden hues. "Higher, Angela!" Jason called out as they swung side by side, their matching grins reflecting their joy in each other's company. Their legs pumped in perfect rhythm, faces flushed with excitement as they reached for the sky. Beth noticed how naturally they fell into sync, as if they'd never been apart. The way they mirrored each other's movements reminded her of how close they must have been at the orphanage. After a while, the children moved to the sandbox where they began building an elaborate castle together. Their heads bent close, they spoke in quiet voices that didn't quite reach the adults, their fingers working in harmony to shape the damp sand. "I don't understand," Jason said, his small hands patting down the sand with careful attention. His bottom lip quivered slightly as he worked. "Why can't I come live with you and Beth and Tom?" Angela's shoulders slumped as she added another tower to their castle, her movements becoming less enthusiastic. "I wish you could. I asked Beth, but she said it's complicated." "Everything's complicated now," Jason replied, his voice trembling slightly. He poked a stick into the sand, creating tiny windows in their castle walls. "I miss you when I can't see you. It's not fair." Beth's heart clenched as fragments of their conversation drifted over. She glanced at Tom, who squeezed her hand supportively, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her skin. Across the way, Sarah Hughes shifted uncomfortably on her bench, having also caught pieces of the children's exchange, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I miss you too," Angela said, abandoning the sandcastle to give her brother a quick hug, sand falling from her fingers. "Beth says we have to be patient, but I don't like being patient." Jason wiped his eyes with sandy hands, leaving smudges on his cheeks that traced paths like tiny rivers. "Me neither. I want us to be together like before when we were at the orphanage." Tom watched the scene unfold, noting how John Hughes's expression tightened at Jason's words, his fingers drumming an agitated pattern on his knee. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on all the adults present, but none more so than the two children who couldn't comprehend why they couldn't simply be together. Beth felt tears threatening as she observed their innocent interaction. The siblings continued building their sandcastle, adding detailed battlements and a moat, but their earlier enthusiasm had dimmed, replaced by a shared melancholy that seemed far too heavy for their young shoulders to bear. "Remember when we used to share a room?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he carefully arranged pebbles along the castle's path. "I like that. Now my room feels too big and quiet." Angela nodded, carefully placing a leaf on top of their castle like a flag, her small fingers trembling slightly. "My room is quiet too. Sometimes I pretend you're there, but it's not the same. I even talk to my stuffed animals like I'm talking to you." Their words carried to both sets of parents, landing like physical blows. Sarah Hughes dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her mascara smudging slightly. while John stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched and shoulders rigid. Beth and Tom exchanged determined looks, knowing they needed to find a solution that would ease their children's pain, no matter the cost. The siblings continued playing, their movements slower now, each trying to stretch out their time together. Their sadness was palpable, hanging in the air like the autumn leaves that occasionally drifted down around them, landing softly on their unfinished castle. The Hughes family approached Beth and Tom, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves that carpeted the park ground. John Hughes cleared his throat, his expression carefully composed as he gestured toward a nearby weathered picnic table, well away from where Angela and Jason played on the playground equipment. "We've been thinking about your proposal," John began, his voice measured and businesslike. "And we might be willing to consider letting Jason go, for a price." His eyes glinted with calculation as he spoke the last words. Beth's eyes widened as she processed his words, her heart skipping a beat. Tom's warm hand found hers under the rough wooden table, squeezing gently in silent support. "What do you mean, for a price?" Tom asked, keeping his voice level despite the tension building in his shoulders and the muscle twitching in his jaw. John leaned forward, his fingers interlaced on the wooden table, his wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight. "We know about the inheritance. If we agree to let Jason live with you, we want the majority portion of it. After all, we've been raising him, providing for him all these years." His tone carried an unmistakable note of greed. Beth felt her chest tighten as the real motivation behind the Hughes' resistance became crystal clear. She glanced at Sarah, who avoided eye contact, fidgeting with her wedding ring and staring intently at a nearby maple tree, as if it held some profound interest. "So this isn't about Jason's well-being at all, is it?" Beth's voice trembled with barely contained emotion, her free hand clenching into a fist beneath the table. "It's about money?" John's expression hardened like cement. "Don't pretend you're above this. Everyone has their price. We've invested time and love in Jason, and we deserve compensation." His words came out clipped and cold. "Compensation?" Beth's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, conscious of the children playing nearby on the creaking swings. "He's a child, not a business transaction." The very words left a bitter taste in her mouth. "Be realistic," John replied, his tone growing dismissive and cocky as he settled back against the bench. "We hold all the cards here. We're his legal guardians. You want the siblings together? This is the deal." He spread his hands in a gesture that suggested finality. Tom maintained his composure, though his jaw clenched tight enough to crack a walnut. "Let's discuss this rationally. What exactly are you proposing?" As John outlined his demands for a substantial share of the inheritance, Beth watched Angela and Jason playing on the swings, their small bodies soaring through the crisp autumn air. Their carefree laughter carried across the park, a stark contrast to the tense negotiation happening at the picnic table. The sound of their joy made her heart ache. "Fine," Beth finally said, her voice quiet but firm as steel. "You can have whatever portion of the inheritance you want. We don't care about the money, we just want Angela and Jason to be together." Each word felt like a victory and a surrender all at once. Sarah Hughes looked up sharply, surprise evident on her face as color rushed to her cheeks. Tom nodded in agreement with his wife, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "The money means nothing to us," Tom added, his voice steady and sure. "What matters is giving these siblings a chance to grow up together, to have the family bond they deserve." John Hughes sat back, clearly not expecting this ready acquiescence, his confidence faltering for just a moment. "Well then, I suppose we have a deal." He extended his hand across the table, a satisfied smile playing at his lips like a cat who'd caught the canary. Tom shook it firmly while Beth watched the children, tears threatening to spill from her eyes as the autumn breeze rustled through her hair. She knew they'd made the right choice, even if it meant sacrificing the inheritance. The sound of Angela and Jason's combined laughter in the distance confirmed what she already knew in her heart. Some things were worth more than all the money in the world. As the Hugheses stood to leave, their chairs scraping against the concrete, Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking as though she wanted to say something. Instead, she simply nodded and followed her husband, her shoulders slightly hunched, leaving Beth and Tom at the picnic table, their hands still clasped together like lifelines, watching their soon-to-be complete family playing in the distance under the golden afternoon sun. If you enjoyed the story of Angela, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.